Last stop, Route Zero. The overnight dispatcher put me on a city bus route I'd never heard of. A ghost shift, they called it. 4 stops past the end of the line to sweep late drunks and lost kids into downtown. Don't pick up if they get on without paying, the old driver warned. Not after 3:13. And I laughed, because nobody gets on a bus after 3:13, unless they're grateful to sit down, fare or not. He didn't laugh back, just tapped the timetable where a gap the width of a thumbnail sat between 2 printed lines, as if someone had scraped out a stop that used to exist. The first hour was empty streets and traffic lights on sensor cycles, changing for no one, a theater of red and green put on for me and me alone. The second hour served a scatter of riders, night, nurses, kitchen closers, a man holding a saxophone case like a newborn, and they all paid even if the reader flashed fail, nodding thanks with the urgency of people who'd waited too long to get home. At 3:12, the bus smelled faintly of rain, though the weather was dry, and a breeze slithered up the aisle without opening the doors. The air pressure wrong the way it gets before a storm that never arrives. At 3:13 on the dot, the lights at the back flickered to a softer color, as if a theater dimmer had been installed only for the last 6 seats, and a woman in a gray coat sat down without stepping up from the curb. She faced forward, hands flat on her knees as if posed by a photographer, and when I glanced in the mirror, the glass showed her profile without meeting my eyes. "End of line?" she asked, and her voice sounded like 2 voices put together, one younger, one out of breath, as if a memory had learned to speak on the ride in. I pressed the brake lightly to feel the weight shift, and the bus didn't register an extra passenger, the suspension reading the same count as the minute before. "Route 0, she said, and smiled into the reflection without looking at me, like she knew the mirror better than the driver. I told her the bus turned around at King and 5th, and she nodded in a way that meant she'd already been there and needed something after. A stop printed in the gap between lines that shouldn't exist. At the terminal, everyone else got off with the exhausted dignity of folks who refused to hurry after a long shift, and the woman in gray stayed seated as the doors sighed open like an offer she was trained to decline. The cleaning crew pretended not to see her, rolling their bins past with the rigid attention of people who've been told not to look into mirrors with old stories in them. I closed up and pulled forward a few feet, then paused, because the route wanted me to idle for 2 minutes before the clock rolled into the new hour. A courtesy to timetables that don't believe in ghosts. "Last stop," I said again, and she turned her head without moving her hands, showing me a face with the ordinary prettiness of someone you've passed 100 times without ever learning a name. "I'm waiting for him," she said, and for a second the reflection in the mirror showed a second head beside hers, a blur like a passenger who hadn't chosen a seat yet. The bus's cabin speaker crackled as if a phone had connected, and a clipped male voice asked, "Is this the right one?" in a tone I recognized without wanting to remember my own last voicemail to someone I'd lost. "I can't run unauthorized," I said, using dispatch language to cover the fact that fear makes people formal, because clarity feels safer than kindness. "Then don't run," she said, and the clock over the windshield froze between 3:13 and 3:14, the colon unblinking like a held breath. Outside, the terminal no longer reflected in the bus's curved windshield. Instead, the glass showed a platform lit by gas lamps and a schedule board painted with hand-lettered routes that no one had served in a century. The fare box beeped as if someone dragged a wrist over the sensor, and the screen read "Pied" in a font my bus didn't use, thicker and serif like an antique poster. The automated voice announced, "Next stop," but the speaker mangled the street name into a word I don't know, all long vowels and a soft consonant that felt like a place you only visit once. "Route 0, the woman repeated, and the bus pulled forward of its own accord, as if gravity had tilted the road down into a neighborhood laid over the city like a tracing paper map. We rolled through blocks where every shop's glass showed a different season than the sidewalk. Winter in a bakery window, autumn in a shoe store, spring in a barber's mirror where no one aged while the hair fell. At each corner, someone stood in that dim zone by the back seats without stepping up, hands on knees, waiting for a stop I couldn't call because the clock had decided to keep the time it liked best. "I don't know where you're going," I said, which felt honest in a way that embarrassed me, like admitting I'd driven this route for years without ever really seeing it. "Back," she said, and the mirror showed the aisle stretching longer than the bus had room for, a corridor running out of sight past the emergency exit into a version of the city where the streets kept their old names and the people kept their promises. "He missed me," she added, and it sounded like a verdict on a night when someone meant to catch the last bus and didn't, the kind of mistake small enough to live in forever. The fare box beeped again, and the printer spat a transfer slip onto the floor that read "Good until yesterday" in the same thick, wrong font. I put on the hazards and stood. Against every rule that says don't leave the seat, because the pass-through mirror showed a shape rising behind her, hand out, the gesture tender and catastrophic at once. "You can't board after 3:13 without paying," I said, as if enforcing a law could unspool whatever this night wanted from me. The woman's mouth opened, and the air pressure shifted like a door in a house you grew up in opening in another room. The old weight of it, knowing every squeak and seam. "Then take it," she said, offering me her transfer slip, which I didn't touch because it looked new and stained at the same time, sharp edges with fingerprints baked into the paper. The second shape took the slip from the floor, and for a moment the bus registered a change in weight, a subtle settling over the right rear tire that told me the suspension had finally decided someone existed back there. The clock clicked into 3:14 with a relieved blink, and the overhead speakers went dead like someone yanked the cord from a wall. The terminal reappeared outside, fluorescent and ordinary, with the cleaning crew midway through a joke they'd started a minute ago by their watches and a lifetime ago by mine. The woman was gone from the seat, the backlights clicked back to full, and the printer coughed out a fresh transfer with the right font and the right date and a smear of carbon like a rubbed word. I picked it up only because drivers pick up what the bus spits out, and the paper read "Good until 3:13 a.m., which felt like a threat if you read it the way a person reads the line in a story they pretend they don't believe. On the next loop, a man carrying a saxophone case got on and sat in the same seat the woman had used. And when we hit 3:13, he tightened his grip without looking up, as if a draft always blew through that row at that minute. The mirror showed nothing special. Only me, only the aisle, only the useless truth that a clock can be on time and still be wrong about what happens when the colon blinks and a day decides it won't move forward without collecting its fare. I wrote up my night as routine, turned in the keys, and told the old driver he was right, which made him nod the way people nod when they've already decided which stories to tell the rookies and which to leave as a gap between lines they can tap in warning when the hour's late. My courier app started offering a new bonus zone in the business district after midnight, a double pay flag that kept appearing between two towers that allegedly never finished their 13th floors. The map pins sat between them like a dead pixel, and every time I tried to zoom, the satellite image glitched into a smear of lights before snapping back to normal. The instructions on the first order said deliver to 13B, leave at door, no selfies, no call. Which made me laugh, because the elevators in both buildings jumped from 12 to 14, like the number had been surgically removed. The night concierge didn't look up from the ledger when I asked about 13B, just slid me a visitor badge that read 13B in blocky label maker letters, and waved me to the far elevator with a key that turned the floor dial black between 1, 2, and 14. The car vibrated as if crossing an unpaved road, and the LED floor counter displayed a dash, then a faint 13 like a burn-in under fresh glass. I told myself I was just tired, but the doors opened onto a hallway lined with old security mirrors, where my reflection lagged a half second behind me like it needed to buffer. The carpet had no pattern, only a thin tread mark running down the center that looked like it had been walked by exactly one pair of shoes for a very long time. There were no exit signs, no art, no buzzing lights, only a dull hum in the walls like a locked server room cooling itself down after a panic. My map said the unit was 13B1000, 307, and the first door I passed was numbered 1307 13B. The digits mirrored as if the hallway were unsure which way to read. I used my knuckle to tap the door, then remembered the instructions and placed the brown bag on the floor, angling it so the camera could see the logo on the receipt for proof. The app wanted a photo, but the circle that usually shows a tiny preview stayed gray no matter how steady I held the frame, like the hallway refused to be captured at 12:19 a.m. After 30 seconds, the preview jolted alive, with a perfect picture of the bag in a hallway that wasn't mine, the carpet patterned, the mirrors actually paintings, and my arm missing from the frame. That's when the door opened to a chain length, and a voice said, "You're late," with no breath behind it, like the words were played from a phone through a cheap speaker. I handed the bag through the small gap and felt a second hand slide over mine, cool, a little damp, and the chain rattled with a polite patience that made me more nervous than if someone had yanked. "No receipt, please," the voice said, and the door closed without footsteps, without a shadow crossing the seam under the threshold. In the elevator, my badge felt heavier, and when the door shut, the mirror in the back showed me alone, except for a wet handprint on the brushed steel at shoulder height that matched the shape I hadn't seen on the door. The LED cycled 12, 11, 10, then glitched upward, 14, 15, 16, as if the car refused to pass through the number it had just used. I pressed the lobby button until my thumb went numb, and the car decided to obey after a long pause where the floor counter became a flat line. The concierge had left his chair, his ledger open to a blank page, where the timestamps should have been a neat ladder of ink. A janitor buffed a clean floor that didn't need it, smiling in the unfocused way of people who look at your shoulder to pretend they're meeting your eyes. "Badge," he said, and when I handed it over, he snapped the label off like a scab and slid the plastic into a drawer full of identical badges with the same brittle, blacked-out numerals. Back in the car, the app paid me double, plus a patience bonus, which I had never seen, and the tip came with a note. "Thank you for coming back." I told myself it was night shift humor, and took a second order to the same zone because every rule I've learned about being broke says to follow the money, even if your instincts tell you to go home. The instructions matched, the unit flipped, the time 1 minute later, as if the building were running a script and I'd just reloaded the same level. On the second delivery, the hallway smelled faintly of ironed fabric, hot and flat, the way an old suit jacket smells when a steamer wakes it up. My reflection in the first convex mirror wasn't a half second behind it, was in front of me, walking just ahead, like I was chasing myself and losing. The door opened before I could knock, the chain knot set, the inside dim like a hotel room that hadn't been assigned in a while, and a glass of water on a coaster half drunk, as if the previous me had taken a break. "Please set it inside," the voice said, and this time it sounded closer to my own voice than the one that greeted me earlier, an echo shaped like familiarity rather than static. On the dresser, a stack of printed delivery photos from the app showed bags arranged in the same spot I was now standing, each photo slightly misted by a blur at the edges, as if the camera lens were fogging from breath. I placed the bag, took the picture, and watched as the preview again showed a different hallway with patterned carpet and framed art of ships at sea, and no me in the shot. What happens if I don't come back? I asked, partly to the empty room, partly to the chain that had allowed me in without comments. "We keep the badge," the voice said from behind the bathroom door, and water ran as if someone were washing hands that didn't dry. "And you keep the route," it added, with a politeness that made me think of contracts more than threats. I backed out, pulling the door gently shut, and when I turned down the hallway, the single tread mark now led directly to the elevator, fresh at the edges like a new pass in wet paint. Inside the car, the mirror no longer showed me alone. It showed the hallway door slowly opening a crack on 13B, as if the elevator had grown another eye and left it pointed backward. The LED flickered 13, clear and strong, not a burn-in, and my badge warmed in my palm now that it had a number to match. I didn't take a third order, but the app kept offering me patience bonuses for the rest of the week, the pin always sitting between those glass towers like a moth that refused to move off a windshield. Each night, I watched the offers get more generous as the time slid closer to midnight, and each night the thought in my head sounded a little less like mine when it said, "One more trip won't hurt." On Friday, I logged out for good and slept through noon, and woke to find a visitor badge on my kitchen counter, the label peeled clean, the plastic cool to the touch like it had just left a basement drawer. The next morning, my apartment elevator skipped from 12 to 14 as usual. But for the first time in years, the numbers rested a heartbeat on 13. Like a tongue testing a tooth. I told myself that was how elevators settle after maintenance, and when I checked the lobby camera on my phone out of habit, the feed showed me walking in at 12:19 a.m., carrying a brown bag. I didn't order. The frame paused, as if someone pressed a finger to the glass, and a wet handprint bloomed at shoulder height on the metal panel just behind me where no one stood at all. The borrowed mirror the storage unit auction was a bust, until the metal roll-up door of number 23 rattled open to a stack of furniture, draped in yellowed sheets and a wooden standing mirror whose glass had gone the color of smoked. T. The lot sheet described antiques, but listed no brands, and the only note taped to the inside wall said, "Do not remove mirror without replacing," in block letters that looked like someone had written them while the building trembled. The crowd leaned in and leaned back at the same time, superstitious and greedy in equal measure, which is the natural posture of anyone who's watched too many auctions end with trash and one with treasure. I won the unit cheap because the good bidders wanted sealed electronics, and this was all dust and wood and the kind of mirror your grandmother tells you not to stare into at night if you've been crying. The manager cut the lock, signed the receipt, and told me I had until closing to clear the space, or at least to close it back up with a new combination. His voice flat in the way of night employees who've learned to keep their stories generic. The mirror rolled on little brass casters that squealed like mice, and when I tipped it to catch the light, my reflection went a half shade darker, as if the glass had a tint that didn't match the room. I told myself the waviness was just old glass imperfections that make your eyes think about water when they should think about wood, because stories about mirrors only get good when someone decides a flaw is a door. The backboard had a chalk mark, a faint 23 circled twice, and a pair of nail holes where something had once hung, the ghost of a hook in raw wood. I left the mirror in the unit until I could borrow a van, closed the door, and walked the hallway past 10 other units that hummed the forgettable electricity of things people don't need but can't let go. That night, my phone recorded a voice note while I slept. 5 minutes of shuffling and a low knock. And I deleted it because I live alone and I prefer facts to dreams. In the morning, the storage app sent a push. Activity at Unit 23. Door accessed. With a timestamp 2 hours after closing under my name, which should have required a code I hadn't set yet. I drove over in daylight, because daylight makes everybody brave, and rolled the door to find the mirror uncovered and angled toward the aisle as if someone had turned it to watch the corridor while my back was turned. My reflection looked normal until I raised my hand to adjust my hair, and the hand in the glass raised a half beat late. A tiny sync error your brain forgives until the part that believes in rhythm refuses to keep clapping along. Behind me in the reflection, a person walked past with a box, only no one passed in the real aisle, and the box she carried had my address on the label in a handwriting I recognized from bills and birthday cards. I didn't turn around, because turning around is how you give a door permission to be a door instead of a painting. So I lifted the mirror onto the dolly and wheeled it out into the sunlight like a fish you don't want to name. At home, I put the mirror in the hallway near the front door, told myself it was temporary, and noticed how the glass absorbed the apartment's color scheme the way a dark lake eats sky. The first night, I passed it carrying laundry and saw a second me step into frame a fraction early like a stage cue, then settle into perfect sync as if embarrassed to be caught. I draped a scarf over the top edge, the way people do when they pretend they aren't superstitious, and went to bed with the door cracked because childhood habits die politely but never leave. At 3:17 the hallway light turned on by itself. My phone recorded a new voice note, and the whisper used my name in a tone that made me think of someone practicing a pronunciation they'd learned from a letter. The recording reappeared after I deleted it, attached to a calendar invite called Return, scheduled for noon at the storage facility, organizer, me. Which is the kind of glitch that makes you feel foolish to fear because offices are built on invites, and we all survive invites every day. I accepted the invite just to stop the buzzing, and the mirror's glass pulsed a little gray wave from top to bottom like a screen refreshing. At the unit, I found a cardboard box where the mirror had stood, taped shut and labeled with my address in that same tidy, familiar hand, a looped 3 that looked like a pair of stacked eyes. The manager said someone had dropped it off with my name and a shrug, as if favors are a currency you can spend without explaining the debt. I opened it at home to find a brass hook, a coil of picture wire, and a folded note that read, "A mirror is a loan from a room you can visit but not keep," which is not a proverb I've heard, but felt old in the way an invented rule feels quickly sacred. I mounted the hook on the backboard, ran the wire, and thought about replacements, the way a museum lends and borrows pieces so that walls don't become jealous. Because jealousy is what stories say breaks glass when no one's in the room. When the mirror hung true, my reflection looked cleaner, less tea-stained, as if the glass appreciated manners. An anthropomorphism I allowed. Because courtesy is a superstition that keeps people from touching exhibits, and maybe keeps exhibits from touching back. That night, I set my phone camera to watch the hallway, not because I wanted proof, but because proof is a soft word you can sleep near even when the house learns new noises. At 2:59, the mirror showed the storage corridor behind me instead of my apartment. A neat row of roll-up doors painted the color of aspirin, and a single figure paused as if deciding which box belonged to her in this version of the place. She lifted her hand in a polite wave, and it was my hand, my watch, my long-heeled scar over the knuckle from a winter years ago, and I understood the note like a set of instructions your grandmother would approve. At 3:17, the mirror surfaced my hallway again, and the apartment exhaled like a lung, returning to a familiar breath. the air pressure snapping back into place after a door closes. I returned the mirror the next morning as if obeying a library due date, which made the manager smile a tired smile because paperwork loves people who behave. I hung a cheap department store mirror in the hall, its glass too perfect to be trusted, and felt unobserved in a way that wasn't relief so much as loneliness. The storage app pinged with "Activity at Unit 23, door accessed," and I muted notifications, a small betrayal of curiosity that tasted like metal in the mouth. Weeks later, a friend asked to borrow something haunted for a themed shoot, the way people ask for spice they won't finish, and I found myself at the facility again without admitting to myself I'd chosen the route days ago. The roll-up door clattered, and inside stood the mirror I'd returned. The backboard, now clean wood without the chalk 23. The hook centered, the wire taut like a plucked string. A note lay on the floor, block letters in a hand. I might have learned if I'd ever learned to write like an ant instead of a person who types, and it read, "Replace what you borrow, or the room you visit will visit you," which is either a threat or a receipt, depending on who is reading. I took the mirror because stories about mirrors only end two ways, and the kindest of them involves etiquette, which costs less than fear if you pay on time. At home, I leaned it against the wall and waited for the sync error, the late hand, the second me who cares about rules, and none of it happened because I'd hung the cheaper mirror on the opposite wall, and rooms understand symmetry better than we do. I texted my friend that the prop was ready, set a calendar invite for noon, and watched the glass breathe a soft gray wave from top to bottom, polite as a curtain before a show begins and as final as one dropping for the night.